very generous introduction. I appreciate that. And thanks, Johnny and Diane, for giving me the opportunity to talk to all of you tonight about intermittent fasting, which when I first read about it, it seemed like a crazy idea. Fasting intermittently, why would anybody want to do that? Sounded not only crazy, but maybe a little unhealthy or risky. So, I researched it, and actually there was some science behind it. It's not that crazy an idea. And then I tried it myself, and it was a lot easier than it might seem. Because fasting always seemed to me like something that you might do for penance or purification or religious purposes, or because you just didn't have access to food. But why would you do it voluntarily? So I've been doing this for about a year. I understand Johnny's been doing it for 2 years, so I'm not quite the veteran here. But it gets easier and easier, and I keep researching it and learning more about it. And that's what I want to do tonight, is share with you what I've learned, both from a research and science point of view, but also more from a practical point of view of how you might actually approach this yourself. And I think it can be done safely, gradually, a little at a time. It's not something you have to just jump right into. Okay, so this is the title slide. Intermittent Fasting for Health and Longevity. And the reason I titled it that is a lot of people think about fasting as pretty much a way to lose weight quickly. And in fact, you do lose weight easily. But that's not what I think the primary motivation should be here. It should be health and living longer. And there's a lot of evidence supporting that. In fact, it's what you can do with intermittent fasting. So, I've given you a little bit of an introduction, but I wanted to bring it right here to myself and talk about my experience with dieting and intermittent fasting. I think I started realizing that I needed to lose a little bit of weight maybe back in the mid-90s or late 90s. And the approach I took was low carb. I followed something like, Atkins, Protein Power, The Zone. Basically, it was an eye-opener to me that carbohydrates might have this role in stimulating insulin. And so I actually lost, maybe 15 pounds that way, and adhered to that for a bit. But it was easy to go off of that and drift up. And it's, I like foods that contain carbohydrates in them too. So it was just hard to do as a strict practice. So in 2004, this is what I looked like. I weighed 175 pounds, had size 34 hands. I was active. Here I am actually hiking in Yosemite with my daughter. But I'm looking back at that, wow, I had a little bit of a punch there. And then in 2006, I was up to 185, and very happy and jolly, but 36 size pants, and I just didn't feel the energy too. I'd come home and be tired. So I really started researching diet, and I went low carb again, but then I started trying to understand what's really going on metabolically. And I would say it's really in the last year that I took off more pounds, and so that's what I look like today. 150 pounds, size 30, I've got a lot more energy. I was talking to Johnny, I'm doing rock climbing again, and I can climb up things a lot easier than I could when I was living like I did on the left side. So certainly weight loss is a part of it, but also all of my biomarkers have improved. My insulin levels have dropped from 15 down to 4. And 15 is getting in the pre-diabetic range. 4 is considered to be pretty good. I think that's average for like the Catawbans and the Okinawans. It's considered to be a good insulin level. So it's not just about weight loss and health. It's also about longevity. You might have seen this story. The world's oldest man, Walter Bruning, died this year at 114. Lived in Montana. Here he is throwing a baseball out shortly before he died. And in the obituary, he was asked what his philosophy was. And the first one is embrace change, even when change slaps you in the face. But number 2 is eat 2 meals a day. That's all you need. And I've looked at a lot of information on centenarians, people who live to be more than 100. And not all of them, but a fair number of them are lean. They're not heavy. and they eat sparingly. So that there's some connection there. That again, started to get me thinking about what are the connections here. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today is, in the first part, just about this idea of calorie restriction, which is, there's been a lot of research on connecting calorie restriction with living longer and with avoiding degenerative disease. And certainly, intermittent fasting ends up being a form of calorie restriction, but as you'll see, a very different way of doing it. And then there's a connection between calorie restriction and a biological principle called hormesis. Hormesis is the other thing that I've become really interested in. It's the really central theme, the organizing principle of my blog, Getting Stronger. It's a general biological principle by which organisms can become stronger in many different ways by exposing themselves to stressors or stimuli that in turn activate defense and repair mechanisms. And this is one of the things that's happening in intermittent fasting, and I'll explain how that works. But it's a general principle, and I'll come back to that principle of hormesis, so remember that. Once I go through calorie restriction, then I'd like to give some reasons why you might consider a different way of doing it, which is intermittent fasting. Whenever you talk about intermittent fasting, people bring up all kinds of objections. This leads to yo-yo dieting, it puts you into starvation mode, it makes you hungry all the time, and I'd like to deal with those objections. And then there's a couple issues that do have some significance that I wanted to point out. But I'd like to end the talk with practical advice. And some of you are probably here because you'd like to try this or you're interested in it. So how do you actually do it successfully? Because a lot of people who try intermittent fasting have problems with it. And they hit a wall, they get too hungry or whatever, and they can't move past that. But people have learned how to deal with those issues, and I have some personal experience I wanted to share with you. So let's start with calorie restriction. Probably some of the really early work back in the 20s and 30s was done on calorie restriction in mice and rats. And what they found was that if you took a mouse and that normally, say, had a lifespan of, say, about 30 months, which is in the green here, and it's eating whatever it wants, they call that ad libitum. And if you restrict it 25%, you get a little bit of a boost. If you cut the calories in half, the lifespan of that mouse doubles. And this is very repeatable, and it's quite remarkable. Now, it turns out it isn't that easy with humans and primates. We don't get that much of a boost. And so, there's some studies going on. They take much longer to carry out because the lifespans of monkeys are longer. But these are rhesus monkeys. They're both 27 years old. They are part of a study that's still ongoing. The guy on the left eats 30% fewer calories than the average. The guy on the right has a normal diet. The guy on the right has all kinds of disease, diabetes, obesity. The guy on the left and the other ones that are eating less have significantly less diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurodegenerative disease. I mean, they give cognitive tests to these monkeys. And about 3 times as many of the normal fed monkeys have died as the calorie restricted ones. So a little bit closer to humans. I mean, we're still different than rhesus monkeys, but it is a primate. So that's some encouraging evidence there. Probably the population that's been studied the most in terms of having a lot of old people, centenarians, people who are over 100 years old, are the Okinawans. They're famous for this. They've been studied a lot. Here's an Okinawan man on the left. Guy who's about 100 years old, looks like maybe a 60-year-old here. There is a significant genetic component there. There have been studies on this, so you can't just look at lifestyle and diet there. So that's got to be taken into account. But even if you factor that out, their diet really has a significant impact in terms of longevity and reduction of degenerative diseases. So they eat probably 20% fewer calories than the standard Japanese diet, which is less than the standard American diet. It's a lot lower in fat, sugar, and grains. A lot of green vegetables with antioxidants, with polyphenols, so there's some health components there. 80% lower risk of heart attack, stroke, 80% less breast and prostate cancer, half the rate of ovarian and colon cancers, and very low diabetes, dementia, and osteoporosis. So a lot of healthy factors, even controlling for the genetics. There has been, that's a natural diet, right? The Okinawan diet that evolved over eons. There was a guy, Roy Walford, who was actually involved in those caloric restriction experiments with the mice early on. And he was very interested in life extension. He actually was one of the guys in the Biosphere Project, if you remember that. That was an artificial terrestrial environment that was enclosed, and they were looking at, with growing crops in there and cycling all of the oxygen and the CO2 and seeing how long that sort of artificial environment could be sustained as a way to get some data for what a future mission to another planet might look like if you had to sustain life on another planet. It ultimately did not succeed, not just for scientific reasons, but I think there were some social issues going on with the people, but he was one of the key guys. And after that, he developed this Cron diet, which is caloric restriction with optimal nutrition. So it isn't just cutting back calories, but making sure you get all of the macronutrients and the micronutrients that you need for good health. And so he developed this Cron diet with a few other people, and it involved reducing calories about 20 to 25% over normal. So if you were normally eating 2,000 calories a day, that would be cutting it down to 1,500. Making sure you were getting good nutrition. He favored a high-carb, low-fat, low-protein diet. It's not my favorite diet. In fact, I think it has something to do with the way he ended up looking, because the guy doesn't have a lot of protein on him, right? Doesn't have a lot of muscle. So it might have been a bit protein deficient. But he was reasonably healthful, and the followers were. He did die at 79, but it was due to Lou Gehrig's disease, which, that got a genetic component, so not necessarily a standard general disease. But people who have been on this diet have significantly lower LDL, cholesterol higher, HDLs, lower triglycerides, much lower blood pressure, and their glucose and insulin is lower. So again, it corresponds to what you see from the animal studies.